It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker in the Signing Mind seminar series, Simon De Deyne. Simon is a cognitive scientist and a psycholinguist from the University of Melbourne, where he is included in both the Computational Cognitive Science Lab and the Complex Human Data Hub. Simon conducted his doctoral studies at KU Leuven in Belgium, where he worked together with Gert Storms and wrote his thesis on the proximity in the semantic vector space. He has held research position at the University of Adelaide before starting his current role as Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Simon is particularly well known for his longest running project, the Small World of Words project, which is a community-driven large-scale project looking at word association data to map the mental lexicon and look at the structure of human cognition. This project now already has 20 languages and still continues to grow to this day. He also uses large-scale computational models to explore the intricate connections between words and concepts. So we are very thankful and of course very excited for Simon to have flown all the way across the globe to be with us today here in person and to give us his talk with the title Measuring Meaning in Mental Lexicons in the Age of Large Language Models. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Simon De Deyne.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And Hope and Brendan, thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing these seminars. I really already enjoyed much of the previous seminars, and being part of this is a real honor. And it's also kind of a real privilege to be exposed to so many ideas. So as you know, I have a background in psycholinguistics, but the sign language is certainly something new to me. But I hope I can contribute something. And if you have any questions, please let me know afterwards. So yeah, as Lisa told before, today I'm going to talk about mental lexicons, but my weapon of choice is studying this through associations. So I'm going to try to cover 4 broad topics. What do word associations measure? How can we study word associations in humans and in artificial minds? So nowadays, those are large language models. And then I'm going to change gear a little bit and talk about studying differences in meaning through word associations. So the topic of semantic alignment of concepts, and you can do that between languages or within languages, different speakers. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about practical applications, how we can annotate and make sense of word associations. So, okay, in a typical word association task, at least the word associations task that we've done as part of the Small World of Words, people get a word shown on the screen, and they have 3 different fields, and they have to enter the first words that come to mind. So it's a very simple instruction, and people find it quite easy to do. So the cue word could be something like deal. Sometimes they explain which sense we're aiming for, or it could be something like archipelago. Is that the right pronunciation? So you can say something like palm tree. And then at the end, they get a thank you message and some feedback. So people tend to enjoy playing that. And we've been quite fortunate to be able to collect a lot of data this way in many different languages. So what we're measuring is free association. This means that any kind of response is a valid response. We don't tell them what kind of response they should give us. And one way we study these word associations is often as semantic networks. So these are networks where the nodes correspond to words and the edges denote some kind of semantic relationships. These edges have a weight, and that weight indicates how often a specific response is given to a cue. And we assume that the meaning in these networks is encoded as the activation that spreads along weighted edges. So you can see a graph here. So if you want to know the meaning between any pair of words, you look at the connections that they make together. A key characteristic of the Small World of Words is that we try to do this as part of a sizable implementation. So we try to capture most of the words that people use in daily communication. And we also use a slight variant of free association. We use a continued response procedure. So that means that we ask them to give multiple words, and that way we hope to get a richer picture of what they know about a word and not only a very strong associate that might come to mind. So we've done this in many languages, and some of our findings have been published for Dutch, English, Spanish, and Chinese. And there's several other languages that are now in the pipeline and will be appearing in maybe the next year or so. Typically, we try to do this for a large set of words. So this varies between something of 10,000 to 12,000 words. And for each of these queues, we have 100 different people that give their associates, right? For some of the projects, that number is a bit smaller. So for example, for Chinese or Spanish, 60 people have been giving us associates. So you can, of course, wonder, well, can simply asking people their associates be enough to measure the full mental lexicon? There's so many words that people know, and there's so many things that can contribute to meaning. And if you look at this curve, this plot here on the left, this shows you a vocabulary growth curve. So this shows you how many different words people produce as a function of the number of cues. So you can see that there's not a finite number of words that people give. It keeps increasing as you collect more data. But of course, in natural language, we don't use each word equally often, right? So if you just look at the most frequent words, we already know that if we get around, so maybe if you have about 12,000 words, those 12,000 words, they cover about 90% of all these different tokens that are produced. So it's not perfect, it's not capturing every word, but it's capturing most of the words, and that's what we care about. So that's why we think it's a pretty decent coverage. Now, other languages have different language systems. Chinese has, for example, a logographic language system. So that means that they can come up with many different words as associates. Despite of that, again, what you see here on panel B is that this very productive language still allows us to capture about 80% of the different tokens that are produced. So this has everything to do with the distribution of tokens in the language. Furthermore, if you look at the types of tokens that are produced, they're quite representative of what words are used in language and how often they're used in language. So the way we collect the data, the way we grow this network, allows us to get a good idea of what words are out there. Okay, so that's a little bit about the methods, but why do we care about word associations in the first place? So what's the point in it? And one idea, and I think this is a nice idea, is coming from a Russian researcher, is a linguistic worldview. And she writes that associative verbal networks describe the experience of speakers as creators and recipients of text and reflects the structure of rational human communication. That's communication. It also reflects the entire previous verbal and non-verbal experience of native speakers. So I've underlined that last part. So word associations capture both the kind of language you were exposed to, but also it captures something of your experiences. And it's really difficult to measure that. And word associations provide us with one way of doing it. So we can think of word associations as a tool to contrast linguistic perspectives of language and meaning versus psychological perspectives of language and meaning. So on the linguistic side, you might think of all the language that's written in books or that you've been exposed to. And you can, for example, think about encoding the meaning as kind of through a neural network, something like Word2Vec, for example. You figure out what words mean. At the mental side, you can think of meaning as the internal body of knowledge. So the kind of things that we know that resides in the brain of the speakers. Now, the question is whether these two things are directly comparable. So if we look at behavioral evidence, so for example, if you put a person in a scanner and they have to decide whether a series of string is a word or not, in this case, a Chinese word or not, and you record the brain signal, what you see is that you can actually predict this activation, this brain activation, differently based on word associations compared to representations that have been inferred through these language models, such as word embeddings. So you can see this here in the plots. You see the activation in the brain when processing these characters with SWAW. So it's SWAW on the words on the top. And then on the bottom, you see the activation of word-to-vec. So what you notice is that word-to-vec really struggles to capture anything of the meaning, at least in Chinese compared to SWAW. Furthermore, what you also see is that word associations capture a variety of different aspects of meaning as is distributed across the brain and not in very specific areas. Okay, so we saw that mental representation or semantic representation derived from language and derived from human ratings or human associations are different. The really interesting question is, of course, how are they different? Linguists have often tried to equate word association with lexical co-occurrence. So can we predict word associations from words and how they co-occur together in text, right? And what they found is that indeed there is a connection. So how words co-occur this is also something that we see in word associations. But that connection is perhaps not as strong as people often assume. So the correlations are moderate at best. They often struggle to predict the strongest associations and so forth. Now, my view on this is that word associations probably access more than just language, in line with that kind of that worldview. So they also capture multimodal experiences. And with multimodal experiences, I mean things like your feelings, affects, visual representations. And a lot of this information is, of course, also encoded in language, but it's not a perfect translation. And we can imagine that there's different procedures that elicit this information. So if you think about, for example, a semantic feature task, where people have to list the features that describe a concept, like a dog has a tail, it barks and so forth, it will probably capture a lot of the visual information, perhaps also some affective information, whether you like dogs or not. And word association has a lot in common with semantic features, but it's not exactly the same. But both procedures are a little bit different compared to what's observed in the linguistic environment. Okay, so to kind of make this point, let's take a look at an example. So suppose you have the concept banana, and I'm just going to see which words co-occur in language with the word banana. So you can see this split by part of speech. You have adjectives, nouns, verbs, and features. So on the left-hand side, you see the most common associates to the word banana. So you have a yellow, long, bent, tropical, and so forth. And then COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American, lists the most common adjectives that modify banana. You have things like ripe, frozen, green. So notice that yellow is not even among the top 10, it's here at the bottom, and so forth. So what it really indicates is that we use language to describe meaning in a context-specific way, in a pragmatic way, not to convey basic knowledge or common sense facts. So you can see that the overlap between COCA, both for adjectives, nouns, and verbs, and features, which is supposed to be like the gold standard to measure the meaning of a concept, is pretty low. If you look at SWO, the overlap is quite considerable. So most of the features are also listed as part of word association. So I think these tasks are quite related. Now you might say, well, this is cheating. You're using simple counts. What about large language models, right? They know so much more. So let's do a specific case study, because I always give this example, but I never could substantiate it with evidence. So I just did this for this presentation. So suppose that we take the words that have very common color responses. So the first response is a color, so like banana yellow, where we take all the words that have this. So we have about 93 cases of that. And then we're going to prompt a large language model, in this case GPT-2, because that allows us to actually get the probabilities of the response of what comes next, right? So we can say a Q is, say, a banana is yellow, or the color of a banana is yellow, right? What is the probability of that adjective? So first of all, what we found is that among all the responses across the different words, the average rank of color is 27. That means that the model lists colors, but colors are not the first thing that comes to mind for the model. They talk about a lot of other modifiers first. So color is not as prominent. And then if you look at the accuracy of color, it's also not that accurate. It's only accurate for about 42% of cases. So this really conveys the fact that language is not a direct way to meaning. It conveys certain parts of meaning, but doesn't convey everything. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what I said. A different way in which we studied this was through psychological experiments, where we asked people to judge triadic comparisons. So I'll just give you some examples. So we had words like chicken, pigeon, and parakeet, so 3 different words, or ecstasy, relief, and anger. Now, in the first case, you have these 3 birds, and people have to pick which one is more similar. In the second case, you have 3 abstract words, and you also have to pick the most similar one. Now, the idea is that for concrete words, there's a lot of perceptual information, and it's a difficult task. So these birds share a lot of perceptual features. Can we actually have a language model that decodes that? For the abstract items, you would kind of assume that language is really good at encoding abstract knowledge because it doesn't have the physical reference in the world, right? But perhaps this is not the case. And one idea is that abstract words might, like concrete words, rely on model-specific experiences. And in this case, some people have proposed that they require affective states or introspective states. And that's part of our abstract concepts. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we found is that indeed, if you build multimodal models, so if you supplement language models with visual information, the performance increases quite a bit. So if you look at the left-hand plot, you see the correlation between the task, so the R on the y-axis, and then you have a tuning parameter that indicates how much visual information you're adding. So if you're adding more visual information, if it becomes purely visual, it's get better. So first of all, what you see is if you're calculating the correlation between these concrete items and distributional linguistic models, it's actually performing not as good as the visual models. So the language only partially captures the visual world. If you add the visual information, performance increases. Now, perhaps what's surprising is that if you look at the abstract triads, the abstract pairs, like I've shown before, if you add information about feelings, affect, whether something is positive or negative, whether something is arousing or not, performance increases quite a bit. The performance increases much higher than what you get for the concrete things. In both cases, adding that kind of model-specific information improves things. Whereas if you add that information in word association, the improvement is quite minor. So that suggests that that information is already redundantly encoded. Okay. So that was kind of the content. The second part has to do with the network aspect of it. So the model, this is what Umfim Cesar writes, the model has the holistic character related to the linguistic picture of the world of a native speaker because it is based on the significance and importance of one or other elements in the hierarchy. The hierarchy is how meaning is organized in a network, right? And so one way to kind of think about how meaning is organized, how meaning depends on other words, so that relationship, is through the principle of spreading activation. The fact that you can see how words are related to other words because they share a direct link or because they share an indirect link. And we can study that with a modification of the triad task, which is called the remote triad task. We have things like tiger, nurse, smoke, randomly related words. And we can see that we can actually predict these choices, what people think belongs together, if we add indirect links to the network. Okay, now this is something that old language models like Word2Vec struggled with, but newer ones, larger ones like GPT-4 seem to be capable of. So it's certainly not unique to word associations, and it seems that these powerful models share a lot with word associations in that sense. Furthermore, we know that they're not only capable of capturing this remote structure, we also know that they're really good at figuring out how similar concepts are or how synonymous concepts are. And we also know that they're actually pretty good at encoding multimodal information about emotions or perceptual information that's related to the visual modality, right? And there's several studies that in recent years have shown really astonishing results, and that have actually changed my view on large language models to some extent. So Because of that, we started getting interested in the possibility of generating association networks as a kind of tool, as a kind of way of transparently studying how meaning is organized. And this is an example where we looked at moral judgments. So we tried to predict moral judgments from word associations, which is something that's possible. And we compared the same kind of task with a large language model, which was given the exact same instructions as humans were given. So come up with the first words that come to mind. And what we found is that the large language model, so if you look at the most common associations that are generated by the model, that they're quite similar to human associations. So you can see this here in the plots. So the red correlation is the one with the large language model. The purple correlation is the one with Word2Vec. Compared to these older models, there's a big jump in performance. Also, if you look at the reliability, so here you see how much people agree in green and how much models agree. They're also quite similar, a little bit lower for the large language models, perhaps. So that's all good. We can also look at the network properties. So control the number of responses. You can look at the network, and you also see that, you know, they have similar properties. They have somewhat lower number of edges. They're a little bit less. They're a little bit actually more clustered, and so forth. So at first sight, at first blush, they look quite comparable. Now, there's still systematic biases in the types of responses that people give. So for example, if you go back to the banana example that we've kind of spelled out in detail, you see that they come up with things like curvy, plantation. Yellow is again third position. So it doesn't entirely capture all the information that's encoded in human association. So promising, but certainly not there yet. A second source of evidence that suggests that large language models only partially capture human associations comes from Chinese. So here we looked at predicting relatedness ratings, so rating how related a dog is to a bone or a dog to a cat in Chinese. And we also plugged in GPT-4 estimates of the same kind of ratings. Well, we generated the associations and plugged these artificial associations into a network. And then we varied the number of responses to get an idea of how many responses are providing us with good estimates for this relatedness task. So you can see this on the plot here. On the x-axis, you see the number of participants per keyword. So it varies from 20 to 120. And then you see on the y-axis the correlation. And what you notice is that, of course, if you have more data, performance improves, right? You see the performance SWO in blue, and then you see Word2Vec. We can't vary the size, but we can vary the number of associates generated by GPT-4. So those are the ones in kind of yellow. Yeah, you don't have to care about R1, R1, 2, 3. So in none of the cases, both for the abstract concepts or for the concrete concepts, you get to the same performance. It always stays below. And what's quite striking is that performance keeps improving as you add observations for the word association data. But at some points, asking the model to just generate more isn't doing much. And so it's not coming up with new information or useful information. Right? So the third observation, which is probably encouraging, is that you actually don't need a lot of information to get reliable relatedness estimates. So if you just have 20 participants who generate 60 words, you're already outperforming these massive models like GPT-4. So if you think about relatedness in general, you can do this relatively cheaply. Okay. Of course, this is really a moving field. This is simply prompting models to generate word associations. I'm sure you can do a lot better if you do things like fine-tuning. And this is what we're doing now. So we're trying to explore if we can actually get better results by model fine-tuning, but it takes a little bit more effort. Okay, you shouldn't trust all of this because I've been involved in this and obviously I'm biased. But other people have kind of tried to do similar things, and this is all very recent work. So this is, for example, a study that I just found this week, where they looked at pretty much the same thing. They had an LLM generate word associations. And here they did an interesting comparison. They looked at the entropy of the responses in humans and in LLMs. And you can indeed see that the LLMs don't have the same amount of entropy. So they're not giving that variety of different responses of different perspectives. So it's much more constrained. You can also imagine that you use these data to predict other tasks in relatedness, such as lexical decision or naming or semantic decision. And again, they find that these estimates, they can provide some of that, but they're not predicting the same amount of variance that what you get in the human word associations. So people have then finally also looked at, say, demographic variability. So trying to generate word associations for a certain age group, for example. And this kind of is consistent with the previous picture. It's difficult already to get word associations from LLMs, but trying to get different word associations for different groups is even harder. And in fact, this has led to this new interesting application where they're using word associations to steer or fine-tune existing large language models to infuse them with cultural values, so for example, in the Chinese, and that seems to make a huge difference in the performance. Okay, so this kind of covers the first part. In the second part, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can measure semantic alignment of concepts between languages. So this is basically the fundamental questions. How do we humans understand each other? How do speakers of a spoken language understand each other? How do silents understand each other? How do minds and how do artificial minds understand each other? So it's a very broad and fascinating area, right? Okay, so how do we map one cognitive structure onto another? So you can study this in terms of like differences at different points of development, say an 8-year-old versus a 20-year-old versus a 60-year-old. They will have different meanings for words. You can look at personality, gender as a biological factor, persuasions, your political outlook. You can look at bilinguals with different levels of proficiency and so forth. So for example, here we did a study where we looked at differences for the word oblivion based on gender. So this is one example for many examples. And we found that indeed men and women had different interpretations of this word. So depending on gender. You can also study this between language. So this could be investigating whether people have different concepts for the same word and what happens when the lexicons have very different sizes. So how do you map those words if you don't have all the same number of words? You can look at differences between modalities, silent and spoken language, and minds and machines, like I mentioned earlier. So first example where we explored this was in the context of native and bilingual speakers. So this is a bit of a variant of the word association task. It's a task where people judge the associative strength of words. So we had English speakers and Chinese English as a second language speakers. These were speakers at the University of Melbourne, quite proficient. They were at the university. And we asked them to judge how related a set of English words were and their associates. So you have some example here. This is the word penguin, and they have a list of associates, and they had to just put them on a scale, judging how related they were. And then we used a procedure to calculate the cross-lingual alignment, so the distance between the two languages. And we tried to then use this distance metric to kind of classify which language they belong to, each participant. And what we found was that for all the words that we studied, there were significant differences in meaning. So despite the fact that these people were at university, they were using English on a day-to-day basis, each of these words had a difference in meaning. Now, even if you look, we did the same experiment with English speakers only, and we also found that in 29% of the cases for English words, there was a difference in meaning depending on your gender. So it's possible to measure meaning differences at a very fine granularity with this kind of receptive task where you have to judge things. We control for a couple of other things. We also noticed that there's this effect of proficiency. So if your language proficiency is lower, you're going to be further away from the other language. So that's all quite sensible, I suppose. Now, what's kind of cool is that you can also not only quantify differences in meaning in a kind of an in terms of a number, but you can ask the question whether people have different concepts to start with, right? So we use a data-driven approach where we identified different groups of people. So you see plots here for all our stimuli, and the dots in these plots, they're actually people, right? So we identify, the slides, the colors are a little bit off, so you have to see it on that screen probably. But we identified different clusters, so distinct areas in semantic space for these words. And then if we color these clusters based on the language of the speakers, we found that there's actually a concentration of native and non-native speakers. So we can see how many different concepts there are out there. So it could have been that there's these clusters are based on other principles as well. It could have been based on gender, could have been based on interest, whatever. But in this case, we saw that for most of the words, these clusters were, so 64% of the concepts were language specific. Okay. And what's nice is that you can also look at the content of these clusters. So how do they load on certain types of meaning? So for example, here you have the word satire, and the way that native speakers interpreted this, they thought about it in terms of comedy, humor. The way that non-native speakers, Chinese speakers, thought about this, they thought that this to be mean, rude, or cruel, so much more negative. Okay, so that was one example of how you can study meaning differences. Now let's take a different perspective and look at cross-lingual semantic alignment. So how we can compare between languages, right? And as far as I know, there's not really been a very comprehensive investigation of cross-lingual similarity in cognitive science that distinguishes between linguistic representations and mental representations. And of course, there's a vast area, a vast space where you can kind of investigate this. You can compare between languages that have different physical environments, like Australia has different animals and so forth. You can compare languages that have different linguistic environments, so some languages are closely related to other ones in terms of linguistic and cultural distance and so forth. And you can also look at variation in terms of concrete and abstract concepts. So one idea is that if you would compare mental and linguistic representations when you're looking at cross-lingual similarity, is that there's going to be interesting interactions. So one possibility is that there's going to be a more accurate alignment in mental associative networks due to encoding more universal or more core, more experiential features, right? So you might assume that we perceive the world similarly, and for a certain class of concepts, say concrete concepts, we're going to be much in agreement. So that's something that we're going to explore here. The way that we did this is based on the same method that's been applied to cross-lingual embeddings. So basically, we try to find a mapping between two spaces that minimizes some distance. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can imagine that if you're successful at this, that the closest point in one language will map onto a point in another language, and the closest points could be translations, right? So this is a relatively unsupervised method. You start with a small dictionary to do the alignment, but you can generalize this to all kinds of words. And in terms of evaluation, we're going to use a series of tasks. One of these tasks is cross-lingual similarity judgments. So they had to judge how similar words were from one language to the other. The first one is in Dutch. So vrouw and woman, how similar is that? On a scale from 1 to 7, well, it's a 7. Schaamte and shame, how similar is that? Well, it's maybe not so similar. So let's say this is a 6.6, right? So this is one way of doing it. Of course, it assumes that you know both languages quite well. Second way of doing it is collecting data in each of the languages independently and then kind of mapping it onto each other, right, behaviorally. And this is also kind of similar as in the third study. So the third study is an existing database, Multisimilex, where they had monolingual similarity judgments in English, Spanish, and Chinese. This is a bit different. They use strict similarity. So that means that they're only looking at synonymy. So if you say good and bad, is that similar? No, it's not similar because they have opposite meanings, right? Okay. So these are all distinct tasks, but they're quite challenging because it's mapping between languages. This is the first set of findings. So you're seeing here the results for different models. So you have Common Crawl, which is a word-to-vec kind of model. It's a model that learns from language. You have SWO, and then you have a set of concrete words and abstract words. And what you see is that in both cases, we're able to capture meaning differences across languages quite well as well, especially so for the abstract case. This is, of course, a little bit limited because we're only looking at Dutch. There might be ceiling effects. So maybe it's not entirely it's not giving us a good idea of what cross-lingual similarity could be across the full range. So when words are not very close as well. The second study addresses this somewhat. It also extends it to Chinese and Spanish, and pretty much the same findings. There's a huge difference between what we can find in language compared to SWO. This is consistent across the languages, but it has a small sample size. So the third study has a much larger sample size. Again, same story, and that difference is found for Dutch, Spanish, and Chinese again. So the results seem to be quite consistent, but it doesn't explain what's driving this difference. So what's missing in models like word-to-vec compared to SWO? What are they not getting in terms of translation? So we're going to try to predict the alignments. Oh, is it? Yeah, okay. We're going to try to predict this alignment from differences that the word pairs might have in terms of word frequency, differences in concreteness, or differences in valence, right? So is it because some word is in one language more positive or more negative? Is that driving the similarity? Is it the difference in how concrete they are? Maybe, right? And what we found is indeed that in human ratings, that difference in valence is predicting a lot of the differences that people attribute in meaning, right? So you can see this here in the highlighted columns for ratings. And you also find the same thing in SWO. This difference is actually fully missed in the word embedding models. So you don't get that. They only find the difference in terms of concreteness, which might indicate like the figurative language users. So this is kind of also consistent with the story I've been telling of the multimodal embeddings, how adding valence improves things a bit as well. So that's kind of our explanation of meaning differences. So the next thing that we looked at is whether certain domains have a high alignment in language and other domains have a high alignment in minds. And this maps onto discussions whether there's universal meaning or a relativist view, right? So according to the universalists, they predict high alignment for words denoting common animals and artifacts, emotions, and body parts, because the meanings are similarly available to everyone, regardless of the language they speak. The relative view assumes that there's less alignments because it could depend on things like similarity in culture and history, right? So what they found was that actually for specific areas like quantity, time, or kinship, this is kind of a high degree of alignment regardless of, well, across a large set of languages, so 41 languages. Whereas for very specific ones, like items or words related to the house, words related to clothing, also emotions, the alignment is much lower. And if we look at the comparison between word associations and language associations, we see that there's actually a higher alignment for effective and concrete concepts in mental representations compared to linguistic representations. And if we kind of summarize that picture and we look at different semantic fields, we see that there's higher relative alignment for things like animals, the body, agriculture and vegetation, food and drink, clothing and grooming, emotion, values, and house, compared to language representations. And relatively higher alignment for things like function words, social and political relations, quantities, possessions, times in the modern world. So things that we typically read in the newspaper. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is also an area of active research. And one of the things that we found that a lot of the findings depend on how you measure cross-lingual similarity. And there's many ways of doing that, and they're not always giving you the same outcome. So this is certainly something that's still work in progress. Okay, the final topic for the next 7 minutes or so is going to be, but I think that's fine, is about how we can make sense of word associations in different languages, right? And words can have different meanings for many different ways and for many different reasons, right? So we can have words that are perfectly translation equivalents, which almost never occurs. You have words that exist in one language, but not in the other in case of seroequivalence. You have words that have multiple distinct meanings in case of multiple equivalents. So you have a word like the English sibling. We don't have that word in Dutch. We talk about brother or sister, but the common word sibling doesn't exist. But you also have the nuance case, like partial equivalence. So the fact that some words have different prototypes, they have different connotations, and so forth. So I think that's something that's word associations are really suited to investigate. So here you see an example. This is the network for the word drugs in English and for the word drugs in Dutch. So on the word on the left, you have the senses that are related with the illicit substance. And you also have the senses that are related with medicine, with hospital, with health. So this is one of the things that's missing from Dutch. So you can directly compare these things. Even if you think about the types of illicit drugs, what we think is prominent or is going to be different. Like, for example, alcohol is more common in the Dutch context compared to the English context. Freedom is another example. It's going to be very culture specific. Freedom in the context of the American history is closely tied with the history of slavery, for example. And that's going to be quite different from freedom in the context of a Chinese person. Okay, so this is all very interesting, but if we really want to address the questions, we have to deal with the ambiguity that exists in the word associations. And one of the nice things about word associations is that it's really easy to produce because we don't have to explain how the cue is related to the response, but it's not obvious how we can track back what the intended meaning was. So can we actually extract what the semantic relation is between the cue and the response? So if you have pairs like boy and girl, are these opposites? Are these category coordinates? If you have word pairs like sink and water, is sink a noun? Is it a verb? Beer and cold, is cold positive or negative? If I would say coffee and cold, would cold be positive or negative? So the question is, can semantic relations and senses be recovered by treating cues or responses as contextual, as context, right? I'm going to skip the whole discussion about the psychology of different semantic relations, because you can look at this in a purely descriptive manner, or you can look at it in a psychological way, trying to figure out what certain things are doing in semantic processing. I'll be brief and just say, yes, there are differences, especially when you look at thematic representations, thematic relations versus taxonomic relations. And yes, those relations will differ depending on when you give an association. So we kind of go through a trajectory when we're giving us word associations. So we're kind of shifting from accessing linguistic information, which you see on the graph here, to accessing more kind of context-specific, embodied or model-specific representation. So more like things that are in an event. We also know that different languages have a different distribution of certain types of semantic representations. And we also know that depending on your proficiency, you'll have different knowledge of these different representations. Annotating these is very hard, but luckily we have large language models that can help us. And we try to annotate word association data using a variety of different data sets. according to this annotation scheme. And what we found is that we can quite accurately predict the semantic relation, at least the general semantic relations that underlie word associations. So this is kind of indicated, for example, through these F measures. Of course, there's systematic biases. I'm not going to go into that, but I think this is also a promising avenue for word association research. The second way in which we can annotate data is by looking at existing ontologies such as WordNet or ConceptNet or BabelNet in the multilingual case, and comparing them to word associations to kind of annotate the relations, but also to annotate the different senses that words have. So this is something that we're doing now. And at the end, kind of what we're aiming for is coming up with a way that allows us to map word meanings across different languages by adding semantic relations, by adding these kind of senses, and then also by providing ways of interpreting what the differences are. So for example, if you think, and this is my last example, if you think about the concept of culture in English and the concept of culture in Dutch, they could be considered translation equivalent or even cognates, right? But in Dutch, culture has a much different meaning in the sense we think about the arts, for example, whereas in the English sense, at least in word association, we think about society, we think about history and civilization. So if you're a language learner, this might actually be very difficult to grasp. And we actually hope to build tools that will help people understand what the cultural aspects of meaning are. And I think that's it for me. I just wanted to, and I'll leave this on the slides. I think there's many opportunities that sign language can bring to the table as well, right? One of the most obvious one is, of course, the structure of the lexicon, the systematicity and the iconicity, and how that structures the lexicon. That's going to be very different, especially because the lexicon is smaller, so there's going to be a lot more meaning that's packed in a sign. So how is that going to play out? Similarly, some of the question about semantic alignment certainly also apply to sign language. You have the bilingual context, and you also finally, I think the annotation part is important because there's evidence that suggests that certain types of relations are expressed differently in sign languages versus spoken languages. So that would be one of the things. And then finally, sense annotation is also interesting, especially because many of the cues that would be used in sign could be ambiguous. So, for example, I saw that there's one sign for grow, plant, spring, and that's kind of co-lexification. These different senses are packed together seems to be something that's shared across different sign languages as well. So I think that's also very fascinating. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Coming very soon is the German one, German data set. So for the German speakers here, please reach out. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. That is really interesting and intriguing research. And I am sure that many people in this room and maybe online do have questions for you. So with that, I am opening the Q&A session. So there are any questions both in the chat or here in the room?
Hi, can I unmute myself and ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I do work on code switching, and I try to use like word meanings of different languages to predict when people code switch. So this is very, very relevant. I'll definitely read the paper more, but for now, I want to ask, like, if I want to use this tool that you developed to sort of measure meaning distance between two languages, between two words from two different languages, what exactly will I be doing? Am I will I be comparing the words that have close connections to these two words and see how much they overlap, or like what is the exact measurement that I will be doing?
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, great question. Thank you. Thank you for asking this. And so the easiest thing to do would indeed be just to look at what words are common in two languages, but it's going to be quite a fragile measure because the specific, if you look at just translating these distributions, it's probably going to underestimate the overlap that could exist. So you do need to kind of abstract from the word level to more to the concept level. So you need a more continuous measure of what the overlap is, so to speak. And that's something that we're doing at the moment. So if we have a bit of funding, we actually received some funding from Google just a couple of weeks ago to really build that tool, because now it's still a prototype, right? So we believe that that's going to involve kind of creating vectors for Q response pairs in one language, and then vectors for Q response pairs in another language, and then using something like large language models to calculate the distance between Q response pairs between languages. So our initial results show that that's quite promising and seems to be working well. Of course, if you're a language researcher, that doesn't help you because you want to use the tool today and it's not ready yet. So yeah, this is something that we're going to develop in the next 6 months. So please, please keep following our work or send me an email and maybe I can help you with that. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sure. That sounds great. I'll definitely reach out. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Now we have a question in the chat by Robert Jasko. And the question is, you mentioned entropy value on the y-axis when comparing humans and LLMs. What does this value mean in terms of word semantics, and how do you measure it?
Okay. Also, thanks for the question. I'm going to try to see if I understand it correctly. So, or I could kind of pull out the slides. Maybe that's easier. So everybody knows what we're talking about. Slides. Okay, there it is. So I think this is the plot you were referring to. So the entropy. So first, let me say that this is not my own work. This is work done by a group in Hong Kong. And what they're doing here is that they're prompting the model to generate word associations, right? And they're counting how many different responses. So how many different responses are given for a specific cue. And of course, that's going to be based on frequencies. So they convert that's the basis of their entropy measurements. So what you see is that in humans, people tend to give very varied responses. If you look at large language models, the entropy is nearly half of that. So that means that a large language model, if you prompt it to give different associates, is going to keep repeating the same responses to some degree. So they don't have access to that variety of responding that humans have. And that's quite similar regardless of the specific model you use, like whether that's GPT or Llama. So I don't know if that's answering the question. Anything in the chat? All good? Okay. Thank you.
Yes, so Robert said, yes, thank you. And now we have a next question by Lee Kizar. I think, Lee, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yes, hi. This was a really fascinating talk. I'm definitely going to be following up with a lot of these papers. I'm curious about the language model embedding. Does the size of the embedding make a difference for, various experiments? For example, like Word2Vec has 50 values in it, or, maybe something small, whereas like a large language model might have like 500 values in it. So I'm just curious if that made any difference, or if you experimented with that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a really good question. So obviously, there's a lot of things that have changed in just the last 2 years when it comes to the performance of large language models, right? So we have tried, we moved from things like word2vec to GPT-2, GPT-3, and now we have GPT-5, although it's probably going to be GPT-4, that's still as good. What we noticed, so I think one of the best benchmarks we have in terms of seeing whether large language models can predict semantic cognition is, in my mind, the triadic comparison task, right? And especially that one, the remote task, because it requires a model to be able to infer indirect semantic relations. It requires the model to generalize, right? So it's a good test in that sense. And so word2vec can't do that, despite the fact that it's also trying to generalize it beyond the inputs. GPT-3 also can't do it, despite the fact that GPT-3 is already trained on a massive amount of text. It's only from GPT-4 that we get good results and really good results. So that suggests that that kind of structure, even despite the fact that you have random words that are not directly related, is very stable. So it's certainly the model size matters. It's of course difficult to tell whether there's more going on than just the amount of training data, because we don't know exactly what GPT-4 is trained on. As far as I know, it's also been trained on multimodal data, and it consists of a series of experts. So it's really difficult to unpack what it's doing exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Are there any further questions, maybe in the chat or in the room? Yes, we have a question in the room. So I would invite the person to the front. Will you be using IS? Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I am absolutely thrilled. I found it to be very interesting. I had many questions actually, but they're a bit complicated. One simple question that I could pose about this though is comparing how different languages are from one another. If we have two language networks for one queue, I'm forgetting what the word you used was. The point is, it's hard to compare two languages and to compare their linguistic networks, right? So if we have two small clusters, I guess my question is more, should we be comparing these at a qualitative level, or should we be comparing them at a quantitative level for number of nodes?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
Oh, really?
Is it more?
Okay. Sorry.
Is there more to the question? No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. I think this is I suppose related to the first question by one of the listeners online. So how do we measure the meaning in two different languages, even if we have a single queue in one language and then a bunch of associates, and we have a queue in a second language, which might be translation or could be something completely different, right? And we don't have a full network. I still think that we can do very interesting things. And what's nice is that I think we can do both. We can do it quantitatively and we can do it qualitatively. So what I propose is that for each queue, you have a queue and then you have a list of responses. but you encode the Q response as a full proposition. So you have something like banana yellow. So you can say, well, banana is related to yellow, or banana is associated to yellow. Or if you infer the roles, you can say banana has a yellow color, right? So you can be quite specific. And you do that for all the responses. And you encode each of these propositions as a vector. And now we can do that because we can encode documents, we can encode sentences. And we do that also for the second language. So then we can actually map the individual responses onto each other as a continuous variable. So even if they don't match entirely, they're not perfect translations, we can map that. And that allows us to kind of quantify how similar they are, but it also allows us to see which of these responses are contributing the most in terms of similarity, right? So we can interpret why they're similar. So we get 2 for the price of 1. And I think that's the idea.
Thank you for that response.
So now we kind of have to look at the time just a bit. I know it's a very interesting topic and many people have many more questions. So to be able to fit in both questions that still remain in the chat, I would like to ask to keep the participants and Simon to keep it short. Sorry about that. So Zed, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Sure, this is probably not a very short answer. So I'm just going to pose the question as a kind of more food for thought and to see if, people are willing to share ideas. So really, this is a great talk, Simon. Thank you so much. It's really nice to see you in person. Really, this is more of a comment or maybe a solicitation for some ideas here, because it's not so much that sign lexicons are smaller, even though that may be probably due to historical reasons, but the lexicons are probably very rich, but we do not have a standardized way to transcribe them. So it's kind of difficult to really capture the semantic richness for signed lexicons. And so the true challenge here is to how do you do that? How do you capture that richness without standardized transcriptions like you have for many spoken languages?
I hope this is indeed more as a comment because I'm really curious to find out myself. So did you have an answer?
I was more thinking about what your thoughts are, but also, if there are any kind of methodologies that have done this, like maybe with spoken languages where you kind of bypass the written forms.
So it's a question about annotation, right? I would have to think about it. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we will move on to a question in the chat, and I will be reading the question out loud. So does the bilingual lexicon enable closer alignment between the two languages than across monolinguals because of those languages?
The last thing again?
So does the bilingual lexicon enable closer alignment between the two languages than across monolinguals because of those languages?
Okay, so this is, I suppose, a question whether the bilingual lexicon in nature is more integrated than lexicons in 2 different languages. I suppose it has to be. If you look at, so there's many psychological models of bilingualism. One of the big questions is whether there's a shared conceptual representation, and then separate lexicons, for example, right? And so certainly the older models assumed that the concepts were shared and then semantics were language specific. But I think nowadays there's also the idea that even the concepts can be slightly different in bilinguals, but all things considered, nobody assumes that we have entirely different lexicons or entirely unintegrated lexicons across two different languages. So it should be more similar. So as a consequence, you can also imagine that the representations of a bilingual never completely map onto that of a monolingual. So it's not that a bilingual is just kind of the sum of two monolinguals in one, right? So if you have bilingual children, I can attest to that. It's a little bit different.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do not have time for one last question because we're already over the time, but there is still one last question in the chat, and we will, of course, be sharing this question with Simon, and maybe there can be some other form of exchange, maybe through email or other modes of communication. So I would like to use this opportunity to thank our speaker again. And this was really a great presentation. Thank you so much. And also people in the chat are saying how great that your presentation was and that they really enjoyed it. So thank you also for all the participants for attending and for this lively discussion, and of course for the people here in the room with us. And with that, we will stop the recording.